So what does Syria's future look like? Let's bring in Nader Hashemi. He's with Georgetown University, and Stephen Heydemann with the Brookings Institution for Middle East Policy. Both have been watching this very closely. And Nader, let's start with how momentous this is. Describe that for us.
What's tough to describe in words, what I'm hearing from my Syrian friends and colleagues is it feels like a dream. No one thought that this could happen so quickly. So it's a huge moment of celebration and optimism about the future, that this 54-year-old, brutal dictatorship was toppled so quickly and so effectively. And so huge emotions now, optimism about the future for what the future might hold, but also a lot of concern as well.
And speaking of emotion and optimism, Stephen, you know people who fled Syria who maybe wondered at one point if they would ever get to go back. Now they're talking about wanting to do exactly that.
That's right. Many of the people that I know who left the country to avoid the repression of the Assad regime, some even decades before the start of the Syrian uprising in 2011, are so excited and just are feeling so much joy at the prospect of being able to return. One friend sent me a picture of her house that she looks forward to returning to, and she said the house is tattered but still standing. And I took that to be a pretty nice metaphor for Syrians as a whole.
Nader, when we talked earlier today on CBC Radio, and we heard this from some callers as well, about the notorious prisons in Syria with their doors now suddenly flung open. Talk to us a little bit about that.
I mean, this is one of the characteristics of the House of Assad, particularly the son. The notorious prison system. There is this, one prison outside of Damascus known as Sednaya prison that was described in a 2017 Amnesty International report as a human slaughterhouse. I just heard reports just about 10, 15 minutes ago that while they've freed many of the prisoners that were in that prison, they're still discovering layers upon layers of prison cells that they haven't been able to open yet. And that's just one prison among many. And I'm also hearing reports that people are discovering new prisons that they didn't know exist. So this is, I think, both a characteristic of the old regime and the joy and elation of seeing these people reunited with their families, discovering that some who thought were dead are still alive, is part of this momentous moment in Syrian history that we're experiencing.
So, Stephen, certainly we're seeing it in the emotions of people in Syria, and we're hearing it actually from governments around the world. Much to celebrate here with the end of the Assad regime, but at the same time, describe for us what the present looks like. How stable, how fair do you think the present leadership, whatever that leadership's going to turn into, how safe it will be?
Well, sure, there's enormous concern about whether Syria will be stable in the future, and that's understandable. But what's striking, I think, is just how smooth and just how effective the first few days of this transition, the first 2 days of this transition have been. We've seen the prime minister of the Assad government remain in place. He told Syrians he would be back in his office this morning. He called on public sector employees to return to their jobs. The coalition that led the offensive against Assad has instituted a curfew to try to tamp down potential violence or chaos following the toppling of the Assad regime. We've seen enormous outreach to sectarian minorities, including the Alawis, including Christians. And we're hearing reports from Christians in Aleppo, for example, that they feel more secure and safer now than they did under the Assad regime. So the initial indications, very early days, but the initial indications are of a surprisingly smooth transition process that's underway. And we have to hope that that continues and that the groups that led the military operation will continue to use good judgment in how they organize this transition on the political side.
And Nader, what do you think? What's the likelihood that good judgment will be used over the next few months?
Well, I think we can hope that there will be good judgment, but, the future of Syria is not going to be judged simply by the good intentions of its key political actors. As anyone who's studied political change or revolutions know, that the highest moment of unity and common purpose and tranquility and inclusiveness is in the lead up to the transition and in the immediate days afterwards. Inevitably, Syrians are going to struggle with what every revolution struggles with, and that is how do you establish a new political order? How inclusive will it be? And there'll be what we will inevitably see is power struggles and competitions for political power that it's uncertain how this is going to play out, but those things are inbuilt in any sort of monumentous political transformation that takes place, including the one in Syria. So I don't think we should have unrealistic expectations. I don't think Syrians are any different than any other people undergoing such a monumental political transformation. They're going to have to struggle with these types of compromises like any other people caught up in such a revolutionary moment.
Let's talk about stability in the region. I'll ask each of you this, starting with Stephen. Are we any steps closer, do you think, to more stability outside of Syria, but in the region of Syria because of what's happened here?
I suspect that across capitals in the broader Middle East, leaders are very involved thinking about what their next step should be, about what the overthrow of the Assad regime means for their interests. This is a period of tremendous uncertainty for regional actors. I think there are some trends that are clear that could potentially lead the region into some period of even greater instability, but could also go in the other direction. One of those has to do with the retreat of Iran and the weakening of Iran's regional influence as a result of the loss of the Assad regime. Another has to do with the difficulties that Hezbollah will now encounter in trying to reconstitute itself, given that Iran can no longer make use of Syria as a transit route to resupply Hezbollah. We have millions of refugees around the region who may well be anxious to return home. And that process, I think, holds out a lot of hope. But I suspect that governments in the region will be worried about managing it in a way that doesn't lead to chaos or instability. So we have a number of factors. We're seeing a really monumental shift in the geopolitics of the region unfold in front of our eyes. And we'll just have to see how that develops. But my sense is that there are opportunities here to put the region on a much more stable footing. And that'll depend on how Arab regimes neighboring Syria respond to the current context.
And Nader, why don't you jump in on that same question about, are we a step closer to more stability in a region that hasn't seen a lot of that recently?
Yeah, it remains to be seen. I share the broad outlines that Stephen has just suggested. There's always spoilers in a moment like this. So I'm very worried about groups like ISIS who want to cause chaos, exploding bombs in key locations to scuttle this transition. I think Arab states are very worried about what they're seeing in Damascus today, because many of these Arab states, had invested heavily in the idea of undermining the credibility of political Islam coming to power in an Arab capital and toppling a dictator, especially through armed rebellion. So many of these Arab states must be very nervous about what they're seeing in Syria today and watching how this unfolds. So I'm cautiously optimistic, but there's going to be huge challenges, largely because Syria has a lot of borders, porous borders, and troublemakers can infiltrate those borders to cause chaos. So something to watch for, but I don't think it's going to be an easy ride, transitioning from, this legacy of 54 years of, one family rule to a better political order.
Can I follow on to that very quickly? I know time is short. What Arab regimes wanted from the Assad regime was the stability that would permit the return of refugees, weakening of Iran's influence in Damascus, and an end to the narcotics smuggling that was a huge source of revenue to the regime. They weren't making much progress with Assad in achieving those aims. I suspect they now see that their possibilities for achieving those aims have increased with the arrival of a new government. And so, yes, Arab regimes invested in the Assad dictatorship, but that doesn't mean that they can't pivot and adapt to new circumstances.
Nader Hashemi and Stephen Heydemann, thank you very much.